The Timmy is perhaps the most misunderstood and almost certainly the most stereotyped archetype of Magic player. We all picture Timmys as bright-eyed 12-year-olds clutching their forces of nature and claiming that every new large green creature is their new favorite creature. In other words, a Timmy is a player whose desire to go big overshadows or even sabotages their chances of winning. There are plenty of examples of the Timmy mindset in media like Kenny Powers, Riley Freeman, Kendall Roy, and Steven Universe, but if the thing that defines a Timmy is their inability to see how their desires are counterproductive, then the best example is probably an actual Timmy, Timmy Turner. Like most kids would do with a set of fairy godparents, Timmy often goes too wild with his power, which leads universally to disastrous results which tend to mostly affect him. It isn't often he gets a wish right, but if he could wish for a magic card to be printed, I get the feeling he'd ask for Smuggler's Surprise. This might be the one time that Cosmo doesn't screw it up. Smuggler's Surprise reminds me an awful lot of Tooth and Nail, the ultimate and undisputably most successful Timmy card of all time. For close to 20 years, the card's been a staple in various formats, even seeing occasional legacy play. Despite the fact that Timmys get such a bad rap, Tooth and Nail was one of the only times in Magic history that they ended up with the last laugh. And even though the Timmys have had a very bad track record with wishes over the last few years of Standard, the time may have finally come for the Timmys of the world to get a win again. And I'm your favorite Magic channel's favorite Magic channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech. What up, Wizards? It's Dev from The Place. Wore the shirt that made me feel the strongest today to show support for the inner Timmy inside of us all. That's because I've smuggled in a bit of a surprise, an instant speed version of Tooth and Nail. Now that is a surprise, and a welcome one at that. Hi, we're on the couch now. I'm told you like that. This card isn't just Tooth and Nail. It also does a lot of other stuff, just like Tooth and Nail. Yeah, in this case, we're not actually searching libraries or anything. That would be busted. Remember, Tooth and Nail was really good, but in this case, we do get to mill the top 4, get a couple of creatures or lands, put them in our hand. That's actually really, really good value. And on that last mode, we can basically cast Heroic Intervention, but just for the big men, which is all we really care about anyway. But of course, the only mode people are really talking about on this card is that middle mode right there. For a whopping 5 extra freaking mana, you get to just throw 2 dudes onto the table. Again, at instant speed. That's the Tooth and Nail part of the card. And I shouldn't have to tell you what the card does. I did a whole thing at the beginning there, but still, just evoking Tooth and Nail seems good enough. When you do it for less mana and at instant speed, we can actually start talking about competitive viability. So how do you build it, Cowboy? Remember, we're in Thunder Junction now, so I might just randomly call you Cowboy for no reason. Now, I think a lot of people are probably going to tell you that Gruul is the best way to build this deck, and I think they have a lot of cogent points. Not only do you get a tally, Primal, whatever his name is, Hunger this time around? I can never remember, but you also get Terror of the Peaks, which is back in Standard. Baby, that thing's in Thunder Junction. Didn't even give it a cowboy hat. That's weird. They should have. But one way or the other, Terror of the Peaks is a really fun card to play and does seem very good with Smuggler's Surprise. But we didn't end up going Gruul or 3 or 4 colors like a lot of people are doing. We actually stuck to mono green. I know, sounds weird, but hear me out. Point 1, we wanted to keep things as consistent as possible. First of all, that made some sense. Second of all, the deck wants to be like 70% ramp anyway, so most of your deck's going to be green cards one way or the other. And point 3, I guess, now that I think about it, in red and other colors, you get to play some pretty enticing, ridiculous monsters and such, but, it turns out that green has all the best huge monsters anyway. And I know that right after I just said that just now, you probably started yelling various nonsense Magic the Gathering legendary creature names at your screen while you're at work. Stop doing that. People are looking. And like I said, green has plenty. Now I get to talk about the card that I actually wanted to talk about the most in this video. This whole thing was actually appropriately a Trojan horse. Why is there a Trojan horse reference on a... Did this happen in Wild Wild West? Did Will Smith create some sort of large horse? I vaguely remember something like that happening in that movie. But anyway, I got to stop talking about Smuggler's Surprise. The real reason that you want to play mono green and you want to play Smuggler's Surprise in the first place is actually to play Vault-Born Tyrant. Yes, big scorecards are Standard legal for like the 50th time. You can play these big scorecards in Standard, which means that you can play Vault-Born Tyrant in Standard, which means that there's really no reason to play any other Magic cards. At time of recording, I've only been able to play with this guy for like a few days on Arena, but we're already like this kid best friends, or at least we're gonna be, man. He's already been in like 5 of my decks, plus all the time I've spent testing this deck. And even when you cast him fairly, he's a freaking menace. But when you get him down on your opponent's turn alongside some other huge dude, gain 6 life, draw 2 cards. Sometimes you play something that creates another large creature that draws you a card and gains you more life. So the amount of just ridiculous value you get the moment this guy hits the table is unbelievable. Even if he hits the table by himself, your opponent has to answer him with an actual exile removal spell. And I know we're in a Sunfall Standard, but any other time they don't have almost exactly that card, they're in a lot of trouble against this dude. Imagine a situation where it's your aggro opponent's turn 4 and they're coming in for the kill, but you've been doing a little bit of ramping at instant speed as they try to strike in. You can throw down a Vault-Born Tyrant and maybe a Titan of Industry. Make the 4/4, maybe gain 5 life if that's what you want to do, and then you can draw 3 cards, gain a total of 9 life from that interaction. I think you're probably going to win that game. Sorry, had to rush off for a second. Had to go kill a bug for my wife. Told you I was feeling strong today. But anyway, yeah, Titan of Industry's in the deck, because we've really come a long way since Force of Nature. Man, like Gaia's Liege would be proud. I'll go so far as to say that Titan is probably like the 3rd best creature in the entire format that you can get off of a Smuggler Surprise on your opponent's turn. A Tally's one of them, and then we'll get to the other one in just a second. But for now, just know that Titan is still an absolutely ludicrous Magic card. A lot of people are playing it on their turn 5 during main phase, but now we just get to drop it turn 4 on our opponent's turn alongside something else, and sometimes we don't even have to do that. Titan is one of those creatures in this deck that you can just drop it and nothing else off of a Smuggler Surprise, and it'll probably do enough work for you. But while we're talking about the big dudes, we got a couple of one-of Baconators that we're playing. First Silver Bullet is Tyrannax Rex. You know what bugs me? There's 2 N's and 1 R in Tyrannosaurus. There's 1 N and 2 R's in Tyrannax, and I feel like that was some sort of screw-up at the office, but either way, it's just been something that's been bugging me for the last week. Well, I've been like writing the card down and stuff, and I have to remember that it's not spelled the way you would think. Anyway, the card's good, right? That's really all I should have to say about it. This might not seem as enticing to play on your opponent's turn, well, with the haste and all that stuff, but it's still really, really good to drop during your opponent's combat step, it turns out. But even if you are just waiting to play this on your main phase with your own mana like some kind of a chump, then yeah, comes down with haste, can never be countered, which is pretty sexy right now against the blue-white decks and all that, and has the big old toxic number. 4 is a lot. Also has a big old ward number too, so a lot of opponents are just not ready to deal with this on just about any given turn. But surprise, there's an Atraxa in the deck. Just a silver bullet right here. We got one of this big old angel lady. She's so pretty. It's a good Magic card, man. And I think that most of the people building Smuggler Surprise decks are probably going to be trying to figure out a way to cheat this into play on turn 4 on their opponent's turn. This is almost certainly the best possible thing that you can drop off of a Surprise in the whole format here. I mean, I guess you could make an argument for a Tally, but if anything, they're even or Atraxas in a very, very close second. And surprisingly, this is usually going to draw you like 2 or 3 cards, which is more than enough. We even have ways in our mono green deck of casting our 1 copy of Traxy, even if we never actually see a Smuggler Surprise, which I think is important to incorporate. While we're talking about big dudes, let's give an honorable mention to Pugnacious Hammerskull, who is a 2-of in the main deck. In case you can't already tell, we're playing a fair number of dinosaurs, so it's like good swing without getting a stun counter on it fairly easily. But what it mostly is just an aggro deterrent, right? If we throw this down on turn 3, they can't even like Witch Stalker Frenzy it away before it blocks, which is kind of nice. So this is just a great way to brick wall decks that would otherwise completely run over us while we're trying to play Magic. Let us play Magic over here. Why are you attacking me, man? So Pugnacious Hammerskull is going to hold off an awful lot of attacks in the early game, and that's very important. But once you start to turn the corner, it can also attack for 6 points of damage. It's actually great. And if you get it after your Vault-Born Tyrant, it triggers Vault-Born Tyrant, draw 3, or gain 3, draw a card. Be awesome if it was gain 1, draw 3. I would like that even more. But either way, this is going to draw you some cards, gain you some life, be a big boy all game for only 3 mana. We also need kind of a critical mass of like large-ish creatures in this deck to make sure that Smuggler Surprise pops off as optimally as possible. So this dude is certainly not embarrassing to drop on your opponent's turn when they think they can get in on you. But like I said back there kind of towards the beginning, like 70% of this deck just wants to be ramped because, you know, we want 4 mana on turn 6, and you have to be fairly dedicated to actually make that work. So we've got a lot of rampy stuff in here. It's almost the entirety of the rest of the main deck. And some of these decisions might seem a little interesting, but I got a lot of ways to justify them. Things like the 4 copies of Hulking Raptor that we're playing in the deck, alongside the 4 copies of Topiary Stomper. I might as well go ahead and tell you about both of these at the same time, because they both help accomplish our ramp plan. They are both dinosaurs, which will matter for a couple of reasons in the deck. We've already seen Pugnacious Hammerskull, but there's other reasons. Aside from that, they both proc or trigger, whatever word you want to use, Vault-Born Tyrant when they come into play. So these are drawn cards and these are gained life. But we're also playing 4 copies of Intrepid Paleontologist and 4 Armored Scrapgorger in the deck. I tried a bunch of stuff in this thing. I thought that Bramble Fam might be good because Fetch Quest is a pretty sweet card in this deck, but it turns out that we want our 2-mana ramp guys to be able to produce any mana to help us cast this Atraxa. If you go true mono green, then I think it's probably worth playing Bramble Familiar, but stuff like that, and even Lawn War Lone Speaker, even though it does make every color, just didn't quite make the list. I'll talk about some other cards later on in the video that kind of fit this category too, but for now, just know that both of the cards that made it into the deck made it in for very good reasons. For one, both of these can help us interact with our opponent's graveyard, which is really important against numerous decks in the format right now that'll use the graveyard. Everything from Reenact the Crime to Rakdos Joins Up to a bunch of other Reanimator decks that you might have to worry about. Not only that, but there's Memory Deluges and other flashback cards that these will help you mess around with. You can take stuff out of their graveyard before they resolve Insidious Roots. There's so many things that these cards will help you stop in the current environment. Obviously, Intrepid Paleontologists can also exile dinosaurs from our own graveyard and then recast them again. We got a bunch of dinosaurs in this deck, so this is a sick ability to have access to late game. And finally, almost begrudgingly, definitely begrudgingly, 4 copies of Bushwhack. I just could not get rid of this card as much as I tried because it's too good. I tried other cards that I thought would be more fun or, dare I say, better, but it turns out almost nothing is better than Bushwhack. It's a really good Magic card. It's the only removal spell that we have in the entire deck, and as much as you'd like to think, oh, I'm going over the top, man. I'm just doing bigger stuff than they're doing. Why do I have to care about creatures? Because you do. Trust me, you have to care about creatures, but it also does help you find your lands, which kind of decreases the land count a little bit. We still ended up on 25 lands because we have like 1.7 billion drops, right? But normally we'd play like 27 or 28 lands. So yeah, Bushwhack actually kind of does help keep the land count down a little bit, find the lands when we do need them, and be a removal spell we need it to be, which is kind of a lot. But let's take a look at them lands because they're not as cut and dried as you might think. Like I said, we ended up on 25 here, but they're not all forest and a Boseiju. There are 15 forests and 1 Boseiju in the deck, but there is also, as you might have noticed, a swamp in there. That's because we have Topiary Stomper, and we can go search up that swamp some of the time if we have plenty of green mana, and that'll help us cast the Atraxa. We don't have to have so many like 2-mana dorks in play to help us cast it. But also to help us cast that Atraxa, we've got 4 Cavern of Souls and 2 Secluded Courtyard in the deck. We are almost always going to name Dinosaur with all of these, but if you have your 2nd Cavern of Souls or your 3rd Cavern of Souls, feel free to put it on Elemental or Angel to help you resolve the Titan of Industry, or for that matter, the Atraxa. And finally, Field of Ruin, just a single copy of it, and I was honestly nervous about putting it into the deck in the first place, but I think this thing gets exactly 1 colorless land without having to sweat it, and I do think Field is probably the best to keep things like Mirex and creature lands off of our back. Now let's take a quick look at what all is in the sideboard before we get to a sideboard guide. First time we've ever done that on this channel, but I do want you to know what all is in here before we move on to that. So we're playing 2 copies of Pick Your Poison to take out all kinds of different permanent types in the early game. 4 Tranquil Frillback, one of the most important cards in the entire sideboard here. 3 copies of Up the Beanstalk, mostly to draw more cards in longer matchups. Things like the 1 copy of Nissa, Ascended Animus. Mostly we want to use this to blow up artifacts and enchantments, but again, if we get into a longer matchup, this is phenomenal, and it makes sure that we can actually trigger Vaultborn Tyrant every single turn once it's in play, and once it's got the 7 loyalty counters, we basically win the game, so there's that too. But maybe the actual most important card in this entire sideboard is the 4 copies of the Filigree Silex. Not only is this going to blow up 1-drops very easily against the Boros decks and multiple other decks like Mono Red in the format that would otherwise absolutely brutalize us, but if we just leave this on 0, it also blows up all the tokens that multiple decks are playing right now. Not only the decks you know about, but also decks like Jeskai Artifacts, I'll talk about in just a second, that are beginning to pop up everywhere in the landscape. And a card like this can absolutely body those decks. Now for our sideboard guide here, I mostly want to focus on matchups that are pretty bad for us, but I also want to talk about a couple of matchups that are more or less even for us. We can pull ahead after boards. Now, when it comes to Boros or Mono Red or Cookies, you know, the green-blue artifacts deck, or really anything aggro, Mono White Humans, there's a few aggro decks in the format, but Boros and Mono Red are the 2 big bads that we have to worry about the absolute most. And when we come across them, we're going to go ahead and get rid of all 4 copies of Smuggler's Surprise. That card is not as good against aggro as you want it to be. We're going to get rid of an Atraxa and a Tyrannax Rex to come down on the number of 7 drops that we're playing. And we're going to get rid of 1 Paleontologist and 1 Topiary Stomper, because Stomper can't block anyway in most of these games. Instead, we're going to put in 4 copies of the Filigree Silex to try to just basically pay a sweeper effect, and then we're going to play 4 Tranquil Frillback, which can blow up enchantments and stuff like that, but is mostly going to gain us a bunch of life and be a relatively big body. Sometimes Frillback can do even more in the mid game than a ramp creature when it comes to bridging the gap and making sure that we actually get to our 6 and 7 drops. Another important match that we sometimes have trouble with is Dimir, and by extension Esper, although not as much. Esper tends to be slightly slower than Dimir, as we'll discuss in just a moment when we get to a matchups guide. Told you we were going to get a little deep with this one. You saw the title of the video, but either way, these can be difficult matchups for us, especially Dimir, because they can pick us apart. So we have to take out at least the one Atraxa because we want to shore things up here in terms of consistency. We're going to take out 1 copy of Smuggler's Surprise, 1 Topiary Stomper, 1 Paleontologist, and 1 Bushwhack. Now to fill those 5 slots, we're going to add 2 Pick Your Poison and 3 Up the Beanstalk. This is one of those matchups where, yeah, they might pick us apart a bit, but we need to win a sort of card advantage war that's being waged. So a card like Up the Beanstalk can be really effective. Yeah, they might have Deep Cavern Bat. Yeah, they might make us discard stuff with Liliana or have Aclazotz or something like that. But if we can keep up in terms of the number of cards being drawn, we can much more easily win that match. Pick Your Poison can sometimes be there because Virtue of Persistence is a very good card against us if they play it, and it's more or less the only enchantment they play a lot of the time, so it's good against that, but it's also great against early game flyers. If you choose that they have to sacrifice a creature with flying, you will often get their Deep Cavern Bat, and sometimes it's even good to pick off like a Spyglass Siren in the early game. And finally, the blue-white control matchup. A lot of people are on this deck lately, obviously. Have you played the arena? They're doing this thing. So it turns out we already have decent game against this deck, but if you really want to blow them out in game 2, just take out the 4 Bushwhack and add 3 copies of Up the Beanstalk and a single copy of Nissa. We want, in the case of Nissa at least, to be able to blow up artifacts and enchantments, sure, but we also want to present them with a difficult-to-deal-with permanent type that puts a lot of power and toughness on the board every single turn. This is very good when resolved against blue-white, and if nothing else, it adds to the mass of giant 7-mana things our opponent has to be ready to counter. Now, Up the Beanstalk is a little bit more self-explanatory. It's just more cards against a deck that cares about card advantage. We want that. Now, before we get to the power rankings this time around, let's do something a little bit different. I told you these were going to be slightly deeper dives, and when I said it, I meant it. Let's take a look at 12 different matchups for this deck. That's right, 12. There's a lot of decks out there, and I played a lot of games with this deck in testing, over 60 to be exact, and even though I kept coming up against the same decks over and over, at least there was a variety of them. First of all, we can expedite this process very easily by lumping things like Boros, Mono Red, and even these various Cookies decks, artifact aggro decks that are usually Simic, but take on a variety of forms. All these decks are effectively the aggro menace, and they are our worst matchup in the entire format. So much so that we are sub 45% against all 3 of these decks. Filigree Silex can help an awful lot, but it cannot do all of the work. There's also the occasional game where our opponent will just get a bad draw or doesn't get the lands or whatever, but we need those little miracles to happen in order for us to beat more or less any of these decks on a consistent basis. As a matter of fact, I will say that there's just about no beating these aggro decks on a consistent basis. The other decks that we feel pretty bad against, from my experience at least, are decks like Dimir and Esper, although I've noticed I have not seen Esper quite as often, and we actually seem to have a slightly better shot against Esper than the much more concentrated Dimir decks that play Deep Cavern Bat and Gix. Just about any deck playing Deep Cavern Bat and multiple other discard effects we are not great against. Things like Liliana and Deep Cavern Bat can pick our hand apart, while Gix draws them cards off of things like Subterranean Schooner, Spyglass Siren, Deep Cavern Bat, and a bevy of other early game creatures that are really hard for us to sort of keep up with, especially if we're on the draw. However, there are plenty of decks that we feel around 50% against in the format right now, the first of which is Golgari. You would think that with all this removal, we would have a hard time against Golgari, and we sometimes do, but if they don't get their Sheldreds or their Aclazotz or their perfect curve out on time, sometimes we can get enough time to actually get to the big guys. And if we can get to things like Volborn Tyrant and Titan of Industry, Tyrannax Rex, even the Atraxa, even a Hulking Raptor, then very often we can start to turn the tide against a deck like Golgari. Their best tool against us is often Virtue of Persistence. Get it off the table as soon as you can. Moving on to the domain ramp matchup, this feels about 50% too, mostly because we're on such similar plans and it matters a great deal who gets to go first. That said, we play our thing for 1 mana less than they get to play their Atraxa, and we get to play it at instant speed, and we get 2 things at the same time, so even if both players play their Atraxas in these games, we often play ours better. There's also the mono-green matchup, which feels surprisingly 50%. You'd think we would be much worse in this match, but honestly, this deck kills a turn or 2 even later than some of the other aggro decks in the format, so if we can get a Vault-Born Tyrant on the table, things can change very quickly. Another deck that feels surprisingly 50% is the mono-black combo deck. Again, it matters greatly who goes first in these games. Our best bet is to just win the game before they get to the combo, and that can be a little bit tough, but if we can ramp it out, we can play huge stuff at the end of their turn, attack with it, and very likely win the game. There are also those games where they just don't get the combo in hand in time or whatever, so again, this one feels mostly 50-50 because it's 2 meme decks coming up against one another. There's also World Soul's Rage, which feels about 50% to me too. This is another one that's a bit surprising, but it's another one where a lot hinges on Vault-Born Tyrant. A lot also hinges on who goes first in this matchup a lot, and how crazy they go with Nissa and Aftermath Analyst, but if they have any trip-ups, which that deck often does, it doesn't go quite as smoothly as you want it to a lot of the time, then suddenly we can get to our turn 5 and drop Vault-Born Tyrant into Titan of Industry, gain too much life. If we get any more creatures on the table, we're gaining a ridiculous amount of life, and we have plenty of ways, especially post-sideboard, to blow up things like the Green Virtue that really help them blow us out. A deck I've been running into an awful lot lately is a Jeskai Artifacts build that seems to have a few different builds, but mostly revolves around Simulacrum Synthesizer. This appears to be everywhere in this first week of the season, and I'm not sure it's going to show up at the Pro Tour or not, but it does appear to be a very good deck that snowballs out of control and can sometimes go above us. We're trying to go above everything in the entire format, but it can be hard to go over the top of a deck that's making 12/12s every turn with Simulacrum Synthesizer. That said, again, I said this one feels a little better some of the time than 50% actually, because again, we have things that can blow up artifacts, especially post-board. That can be very important. We have creatures that are relatively large and actually get to them around the same time they start making large constructs. So there are a lot of different ways a game can go if you're up against Jeskai, but again, things feel slightly more than 50%, especially after sideboards. But the last deck I want to talk about is the one that we do the best against. We are over 55% against blue-white control, and I think that if nothing else is noteworthy about this deck, it's that stat right there. The ability to cast Smuggler Surprise as an instant is great, especially considering if your opponent does counter the Smuggler Surprise on their turn, then suddenly you have mana on your turn to cast either one of the large dudes you were going to cast with Smuggler Surprise. We often get into a loop with blue-white control where, sure, they kill this guy, they counter that guy, they kill this guy, but we have so many large creatures in our deck, especially post-sideboard. We have up the Beanstalk to help us draw cards, and we can really beat up on blue-white, especially if we do get a Beans out or more than a couple of large creatures to cast, especially with Cavern of Souls on the table. As a matter of fact, our example game this week is against blue-white control, just to start to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Opponent even gets to go first. They start on island, we start on forest. Our opponent will have some mana problems this game, but not really enough to count. They get to deduce and draw more cards than us in the early game. They also do nothing on their early turns to hold up. We try to Topiary Stomper, they just bust their clue. They don't quite have counter magic yet, or they're saving their counter magic. That said, we'll have 5 mana next turn, and we can try to let go on Invasion of Zendikar, which again I was playing in earlier builds before I was on Hulking Raptor. Now, we get to let this go, get a couple of forests out of our deck. This is before we were playing the one swamp as well. Get in with the Topiary Stomper on our own invasion, and that is going to soak up a block from the Cutzel's Flanker that came into play on our opponent's last turn. Playing it at main phase speed, their sorcery speed seems odd. I understand that, but it had about the same effect as if they had not, if they had played it on our turn. The Assimilation Aegis, our Topiary Stomper away, that gives us some time to play Tyrannax Rex, which can't be countered. Get down, get in some damage with it. This is going to force the issue on a Sunfall so that they don't die very quickly. That is going to tap down all of their mana, and look at what we can do Now, everybody, we wait for a second to think about whether or not we want to cast Smuggler Surprise right now. We decide to rip it off, and then we realize that we can actually cast the first 2 modes on it with our 8 freaking mana. We don't get too much card advantage, but we do get a Boseiju and a Lana War Loam Speaker off of it. We drop Vault-Born Tyrant and Titan of Industry, and all of the triggers in the world go off. We get to destroy an artifact or enchantment. We choose the Aegis, get our Topiary Stomper back. We also get to keep a shield counter on something from the Titan. That's also going to bring another land into play and proc Vault-Born Tyrant again, so we gain 9 and draw 3 against blue-white control on that turn. Even if they have a Sunfall, doesn't matter. We got a hand stocked full of guys, we win. Hello again, everybody. I'm back on camera. We did it, fam, so why don't we celebrate with a couple of power rankings? Why aren't they coming up? Where's the power rankings? And why do I smell coffee? Coffee, why? This week, on the coffee break, we'll be looking at all the cards that didn't quite make the cut. As usual, over the course of the brewing process, we tried a steaming mug full of cards, but some just weren't quite up to our standards. This included multiple large men that we attempted to play in this deck, like Surik and Goreclaw, and Galta, Stampede Tyrant. Even though we wanted this brew to be as Timmy as possible, there are only so many large men you can play in your deck, and the ones that we ended up on had far more impact than either of these. But those aren't all the big creatures that we played in our big creature deck. There's also 5-drops like Defiler of Vigor, O'Hare Kaslam, and of course, Vorinclex. We also tried the brand new Railway Brawler, as well as Thrun, Breaker of Silence in the sideboard. At the end of the day, we quickly realized that we needed to focus on the top end of the deck and how to get there as quickly as possible. So a lot of these mid-range creatures hit the cutting room floor. But we didn't just try out 5-drops and up for this deck. We also experimented with a variety of 2-drops aside from the ramp creatures we ended up on. One that I was particularly excited with at first was Flourishing Bloomkin, but it turns out we needed the ramp more in the 2-drop slot, and we ended up playing a lot of non-forest lands in the final build. A slightly weirder 2-drop that we tried was Fauna Shaman, even attempting to combo it at one point with Howlpack Piper. This attempt was particularly short-lived. All the cards that we could cut to add either of these cards are better than these cards. As a matter of fact, none of the attempts that I made to cut Bushwhack from the deck were successful. It turns out you do need it. Finally, the 2 cards I'd like to advocate for the most in this coffee break are Glimpse the Core and Invasion of Zendikar. A great deal of our ramp cards in this deck are 2-drop creatures that have to remain on the board to actually help us cast things ahead of schedule. This is a weakness, even with the obvious upsides of playing both Intrepid Paleontologist and Armored Scrapcorger in this meta. I still think that it might be worth it to just play land ramp. You could even use Invasion of Zendikar to help you get non-forest lands from your deck and thus help you cast the Atraxa if you decide to continue playing it. Overall, I do think Hulking Raptor slightly edged out Invasion of Zendikar for a few different reasons. It's a large creature that triggers Vault-Born Tyrant, it's also a large creature that can be dropped off Smuggler Surprise, and it's uncounterable with a Cavern of Souls in play. That said, it also takes away a large portion of your ramp if Hulking Raptor happens to die to a Sunfall, not to mention the fact that it only really allows you to ramp into a Smuggler Surprise played during your main phase, which does dampen the effect of the card slightly. All that is to say that there are definitely advantages and disadvantages to playing either one of these cards over the other. That's all for the coffee break this week. We'll be back next week with God knows what. I released Dev from his paralysis. Oh my god, I was paralyzed that entire time? I didn't even realize. I think they knocked me out somehow. I'm not really sure how coffee magic works, but can we do a power ranking now? Thank you, coffee people. Jeez, I don't do those, by the way. I'm not the one editing those. I don't know how they end up in the videos. It's a mystery to me, but I hope you enjoy them. I don't know what's going on with them. They're kind of freaking me out, to be honest. But power rankings, numbers, that will calm me back down. A final score of 64.5, Nintendo 64.5, which is actually one of the lowest scores for a first deck tech of the season that we've had in a while. But don't let that fool you. This is still a strong deck against certain other decks, which is important. But one thing this is certainly not is a best of 1 deck. Do not try this deck out in best of 1 and be like, Dev, I went 0-12 with this deck. Yeah, you played in best of 1. You played against nothing but Boros and Mono Red. You died every single time. This deck is not great against, especially without a sideboard. This deck is just not very good against aggro. Again, you might win by some miracle. Oh, they kind of kill you on turn 4, but I got just enough mana to Smuggler Surprise, Titan of Industry, Vaultborn. I guess I win. You suck, Mono Red. Like, sometimes that will happen, but for the most part, Mono Red and Boros, especially when they're on the play, are more or less, you can go ahead and hand in the match card to the shopkeep right there. It's 0-2. They win, you know, so just sometimes certain decks have to just write off matchups entirely, and aggro is one of those matchups. Now, against nearly everything else in the format, you've got a 50% or better shot, especially after you get to sideboards, and that is actually a pretty strong deck. It's more than the sum of its parts, even given the fact that the individual parts are all like 7-mana dudes that completely murder your opponent. So if you're in like a top deck battle, you're probably going to win those. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of ridiculously powerful cards in the deck. That's why that first number is so high. As far as speed goes, it's entirely contingent on your ramp plan, but when you do get the ramp, deck is actually fairly fast. Synergy is a 6 because, again, it's mostly a ramp deck. All the parts feed into each other in that way, but Synergy's not too high. It's not like we're aristocrats or combo or anything. Versatility's 4 because the deck don't really do a whole lot but cast big dumb guys. Resiliency is a 6, mostly because of Vaultborn, Tyrant, and Titan of Industry. If we can get to either one of those, we can start turning the corner. That's what the deck wants to do, turn the corner. You're going to go to like 8 before you do anything in a game of Magic, but then you'll win. That's how turning the corner works. That equals resiliency. There's also a fairly high offense once you actually get to start playing creatures and your Topiary Stomper comes online. Defense is a 4 because Bushwhack, and that's about it. Otherwise, we're just blocking with big men. Aside from that, game 1 is a 7. I feel like that could more easily be a 6.5 and I'd be happy with it. So we'll just call it a final score of Nintendo 64. After boards though, I want to keep that an 8 because this deck is much, much better after boards against nearly every single deck in the format. And then finally, consistency is 7.5. Yeah, we're a mono-colored deck, but there's going to be games just like every other ramp deck where like, oh, I got all the ramp guys, but I didn't get a Smuggler Surprise. I got all the ramp guys, but I didn't get any huge dudes. I got a Smuggler Surprise and 2 huge guys, didn't get the ramp. Things have to come together in a deck like this, and they often do, but there's obviously going to be those games where it's like, I drew 7 forests and 8 ramp men, and that was it. You got to expect that sometimes. That's just Magic the Gathering. I'm told that kind of variance is what makes it fun. I'm told that. I don't know some of the time, but either way, you do have to expect that there's going to be some weird variance in your draws from game to game. But for the most part, all you got to do is get to like turn 5 with this deck, and you probably win. Even when you're losing, it can sometimes be really fun to just play big, dumb, bomby dudes, right? That's the pinnacle of Magic. Even if you're not a Timmy, give this thing a shot because I bet you're more of a Timmy than you think you are once you actually do some of the stuff the deck can do. And before you know it, it'll be your opponent's last surprise. Take them out on a Persona 5 joke absolutely no one will get. Let's go, comment section. But either way, that is all I've got for this one. Just let me know how you felt about all the goings on down there. Other ways we could build the deck. You're interested in that Gruul version, maybe a Jund version. There's all kinds of ways to build with Smuggler's Surprise. So let me know what cards you want to see in the deck or what cards you would have put in the mono green version for that matter. Aside from that, if you like the video, take a second and like the video. Do that for your favorite YouTubers. You have no idea how much that helps. It's unbelievable how low effort that action is and how much it helps us all. So I'm not saying you absolutely have to do it or anything. I can't tell you what to do, but if you take a second out of your day, it would mean a lot to me. You can also sub to the sandwich if you want to see more stuff like this in your recommended feed from time to time. And of course, if you really want to help out around here, you can throw $1 into the Patreon pot. This video's patron of the day, speaking of, by the way, is one Jamie McLean, a $10 patron for a few months now. That is, you're spending the big bucks over there, Jamie. I really appreciate the support, and honestly, it's people like that are the entire reason that I can even do these like 45-minute deep dive deck techs as my job. I really appreciate that. And if you want to help make the videos even better around here, which I think the patron's been doing for the last like few years at this point, then just again, all I really request is $1 a month on Patreon, link in the description, and you can vote on what content we even do around here in the first place. But for now, it's time to bring it home, everybody. That is Allski Kowalski. If you can't tell, it's very hot in my office. I have grown more and more tomato-like in the face as the video has gone on because it is Georgia hot in here. So I gotta get out of here. Love you guys. Hit me up in the comments section, and we'll see you again really, really soon with some other content. I got a lot of stuff planned for the next couple of weeks, guys. Rotation's coming up. It's going to be a lot of fun. But either way, stick with the channel, and I hope you enjoyed this one. See you guys next time. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.